We are going to spend the next 20 minutes or so dissecting a conversation that I had with Russia's ambassador to the UK, and of course, looking at what next in the war in Ukraine. We've got plenty of questions, so I'm going to go through these questions and put them to Professor Michael Clarke and Dom. And hopefully we'll be able to have a better idea of what the ambassador meant by some of the things he said and what it means for the overall conflict. This session today is titled, "Do Ukrainian Raids on Russia Really Risk World War III?" And I'm going to begin by asking a question from Simon, who said, "Do the recent Ukrainian raids and attacks really risk World War III, as Russia's ambassador to the UK told Yalda?" Dom, I'm going to begin with you, just for you to just sum up really quickly for us what happened last weekend with those drone strikes that Ukraine launched deep inside Russian territory.
Yeah, so the Ukrainians launched an operation of extraordinary audacity and sophistication that they had been planning for 18 months, we understand. They smuggled in a number of articulated lorries with kind of containers on the back, which I think were sort of disguised as they looked like sort of garden sheds or sort of garden offices. And inside those containers were drones, not particularly sophisticated drones, but they were able to, from those containers, launch attacks on air bases a lot further than they've attacked before, so in the far north of the country, the far east of Russia, and they did devastating damage and took out a number of, most significantly, Russian strategic bombers. And that, I think, was the kind of line of attack that Ambassador Kellen was taking with you yesterday, and kind of justifying why he said his leader, Vladimir Putin, had been speaking to Donald Trump, because he was saying this attack was terrorism, he said, but also he said it was upsetting and threatening the strategic balance. So that's the line he was putting across. Ukrainians, of course, would say it wasn't terrorism at all. It was military force being used against military targets, and therefore, within the rules of war, was entirely justified.
Yeah, Professor Michael Clarke, one thing that Dom pointed out there that the ambassador kept saying throughout the 40-minute interview or so was the fact that there is this, strategic stability or strategic balance, that this agreement between the United States and Russia, and the fact that he felt Britain was to blame for that drone strike. He said, the kind of capabilities that we saw Ukraine does not have, and it is the British military, its intelligence services, who are aiding, abetting, funding, supporting the Ukrainians, and were very much behind this. He said that they didn't believe it was Washington; they believed it was London. Just talk to us a little bit more about how much the British military is working alongside the Ukrainians, and is it plausible, even though the Ukrainians say that this was an entirely Ukrainian operation, that perhaps using, British satellite imagery and intelligence, they've managed to be able to pull this off?
Yeah, it's very unlikely, Yalda. I mean, it's true. Absolutely, it's not news that British intelligence and American intelligence, or NATO intelligence, including American and British and other intelligence agencies, help Ukraine. They help them with targeting. They help them with location of areas and possible targets. I mean, that's been stated from the very beginning. It's part of the help which we give, and the United States gives a lot more help to Ukraine in that respect than its NATO allies, because it's got the assets to do it. So, that's the way it is. Did the Ukrainians need help for this one? I very much doubt it, because it was 18 months in the planning. The operational security for such a complex operation would have been a very, very tight indeed. The Americans say they had no knowledge of it. I'm pretty sure that's true. I'm pretty sure the British would have had no knowledge of it, because the Ukrainians wanted to do this themselves. And the Ambassador Kellen, said that it needed geostrategic or geolocation, which they could only get from the British. That's not true at all. I mean, Sky News has got geolocation via the Capella Space Organization, which has synthetic aperture radars, which it uses, and we've used in this week. Maxar Technologies, they do satellite photography. Everybody knows where the bases are. I mean, even if you're talking about the Belaya base in Irkutsk in Siberia, everyone knows where the bases are, and anyone can use satellite imagery, commercially available satellite imagery, to photograph what's there. So the Ukrainians didn't need external help with this because it was a very low-tech attack in itself, but a very sophisticated attack in the way that it was planned. But of course, the ambassador always wants to put the blame on the British because they assume that Britain is the sort of European leader against Ukraine, which is true. And they always want to make out that everything that Ukraine achieves is somehow because of the British. I don't know if Britain was involved or not, but I think it's very doubtful. And indeed, when Ukraine's done this sort of thing before, they've not told their allies, partly because they think if they tell their allies advise them not to do it. I mean, when they invaded Kursk, they moved into Kursk in August last year. They clearly didn't tell the allies, and the allies admitted they didn't know beforehand that the Ukrainians were going to do it. If the Ukrainians had asked permission, could they use Western tanks and armored vehicles inside Kursk? We'd have probably said no. So they did it anyway. And that's the case with this. They pushed their luck, and the SBU who organised this, Vasil Malyuk, made it pretty clear that this was a big operation run from the top. There's no reason why Britain would have needed to be involved, and I'm pretty sure that Britain wasn't involved on this occasion. But we are involved, no news about it, in general, in helping Ukraine with intelligence material.
Yeah, the ambassador once described Britain as the head of the octopus in terms of, where they view Britain. But Dom, you've spent a fair bit of time in Ukraine from the beginning of this conflict, but also in the last few weeks. The Ukrainians, launched this audacious attack, knowing that there would be some kind of retaliation from the Russians. And that's one of the other questions. Someone's asking here, could Russia retaliate against, this one's asking about the UK. But first of all, before we go into a potential attack from the Russians on the UK, which is what this question is, just talk us through the potential things that the Russians might have on the table in terms of launching an attack, a retaliatory attack on the Ukrainians.
Yeah, well, I mean, what we saw overnight was, I think, the beginning of retaliatory action by the Russians. In fact, the Russians have been pretty upfront about that. Their spokesperson at the Kremlin, Dmitry Peskov, make it pretty clear that the attacks, and they were one of the worst nights that cities across Ukraine have had for a long time. A lot of drones and cruise missiles fired at cities and towns the length and breadth of Ukraine. And that, I think the sense we have is that could be just the beginning of a sort of period of aerial assaults on Ukraine in revenge for the attacks on the air bases. And I think the way they're being presented by the Russians is totally disingenuous. They're saying that and it's typical sort of Russian doublespeak in the sense they're saying that Ukrainians' attacks on the air bases were terrorism. Terrorism is the use of force against and violence against civilians for a political end. As I said earlier, these attacks were military attacks on military targets, the Ukrainians versus the Russians. What the Russians did overnight was largely, it seems, attacks on civilian neighbourhoods using cruise missiles, caliber cruise missiles and others that have a sort of payload of 500 kilograms of explosives against apartment blocks. And with the pictures we've seen are pretty dramatic from Lviv in the far west to Kharkiv in the east and Kyiv in between. Largely residential areas, and the dawn time pictures are residential blocks, block after block with big holes in them. So the Russians have been taking revenge, retaliatory action, and meting it out largely against the people of Ukraine, accusing their enemies of being terrorists, but actually carrying out what effectively is kind of terrorist aerial assaults overnight, and probably more to come.
Before I go back to Michael, I just want to ask you, Dom, Gavin is asking here, do we think this war is about to change to an even more dangerous situation? Could the recent Ukrainian strikes be a turning point? Well,
I think if you look at the kind of trajectory over the last few weeks, so when I was in Kyiv a few weeks ago, there was some kind of guarded, cautious optimism towards some kind of diplomatic progress, because we had the leaders of Britain, France, Germany and Poland going to Kyiv, standing alongside Zelensky, demanding the Russians agree to a ceasefire, and there was a sense of sort of a concerted, united pressure on the Russian leader to agree to a ceasefire. Donald Trump effectively let Putin off the hook, Putin asking for talks instead, and that's given him a kind of off-ramp to that kind of what had seemed a rather sort of relentless pressure towards a ceasefire. And what we've seen now really is that diplomatic progress kind of unraveling, and Donald Trump, it seems kind of actually aiding and abetting the Russians in letting them kind of at least taking the pressure off the Russians towards ceasefire and diplomatic progress. So yeah, I think it's not necessarily going into a much more dangerous situation, but if you combine that kind of lack of progress diplomatically with what is clearly an escalation by the Ukrainians, it does seem to be heading in a more dangerous situation. I think the Ukrainians are kind of walking a tightrope here. On the one hand, they've got to show good faith with the diplomacy. They've got to look like they're working towards a ceasefire, but they've also got to push back against this kind of narrative that is being pushed from the White House, which is that they have no cards to play, that ultimately they're in a losing battle against Russia, and therefore they should take any kind of whatever they can salvage from the diplomatic process because they can't win this war. And in a way, the Europeans have been going along with that line because it kind of gets them off the hook. I think there's a certain amount of political expediency at work here. The Ukrainians, with enough support from the West, can push back against the Russians. And I don't really buy this line they can't win. I don't know how Michael comes down on that side of the argument, but Europe has 10 times the economic might of Russia. Had that at the beginning of the war, certainly has more than that now. With enough support economically and militarily, the Ukrainians have a good chance of prevailing against the Russians. Certainly the Russians aren't, it's not inevitable that the Russians win this war, but that's a kind of two-edged, I guess, sort of challenge for the Ukrainians is showing willing for a ceasefire, but also pushing back against this narrative that they can't possibly win.
And I'll get your views in a moment, Michael, on that, whether you think that Ukraine could be in a position, to win this conflict, whatever winning looks like. But there's a question here from Kyle. How big an impact do Ukraine strikes really have if Russia can keep replenishing? And can Russia and its economy continue this war forever?
Yeah, I mean, the Russians will find it hard to replace what they lost in this particular strike on Sunday if the Ukrainians are right that they damaged or destroyed 41 of the strategic bombers, which are the Bears, the backfires, where we've got some evidence of that from the videos. Not sure how many Blackjack bombers, the 160s that they might have got, the Tupolev 160s, which are the most modern. But if it turns out that the Ukrainians are right, and I suspect that they normally are on these things, and the evidence that's come out so far supports the part of the story that we can check, then the Russians have lost a third of their strategic bomber force, which they will find it difficult to replace. They're not making Bears anymore, the Tupolev 95, and they will try and repair some of the Tupolev 22s, the backfires. So it will put a bit of a hole in their strategic air force, the actual aircraft that they use. But remember, they have submarines and they have land-based missiles. The idea that Ambassador Kelly was talking about, that somehow this upsets the strategic balance, is rubbish. It's absolute rubbish. But it actually does affect the number of bombers that the Russians can use, because they're using those bombers to release cruise missiles against and also glide bombs in some cases against Ukrainian targets. So it does have a direct impact on the war for Ukraine. For Ukraine itself, can they carry on? Yes, they can, and they're determined to show that they can. They keep, making the point. We are not the victims in the sense that we're not playing the victim. We are the victim of the aggression, but we're not going to play the victim. We can fight, and we can continue to fight. Whether it's a good strategic argument for them to do that is a matter that people, wonder about. And the willingness of their population to carry on is not obvious, is not completely evident. But then the Russians are only offering them surrender terms, complete surrender terms, which would be the suicide of Ukraine as an independent country. And in that situation, the Ukrainians look as if they would carry on. The Russians themselves, of course they can keep going. I always say the Russian military is like a sponge. You can bang into it, but it will somehow recreate itself. But it's a very slow sponge, and it's not learning very much. It's actually getting worse in terms of the sort of operations it can carry on. And the Russian economy, again, the Russian economy is not going to collapse, but it is under some strain in the sense that it's been bent out of shape. And if the Ukrainians carry on for the rest of the year, if they do, and if enough Western powers support them, then the Russian economy will find it much more straining next year to continue this war. And, if Putin stays in power, then he might just keep on going regardless of what it does to the economy. But at some point in the next, let's say, year to 18 months, if the war continues at around about this pace, the Russian economy and the political system almost certainly will come under some sort of strain, real strain. Now, what that will do to the war, we just don't know. It's too uncertain. But the Russians can't carry on and pretend that this is just all a special military operation. It clearly isn't. It is a war for which they're sacrificing more and more. And the latest estimate from CSIS in Washington, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, is that the Russians now have lost about 1 million. The Ukrainians, they think, have lost about 400,000. That's total casualties. And that million will almost certainly double in size by this time next year if the Russians carry on at the same tempo.
There's just another question here for you, Michael, from Pete, who says, what is stopping Ukraine launching, say, 1,000 drones at the Kerch Bridge in Crimea, which it targeted this week in one attack? Surely any air, sea or land defense wouldn't be able to prevent such a swarm.
Well, that's possible, depending on what missiles you might be talking about. And the other thing is, I mean, you need to throw quite a lot of missiles at the Kerch Bridge to make sure that 3 or 4 got through and were not intercepted. I mean, the Russians have got very intense defences all around the Kerch Bridge now because it matters so much to them. And the other point is that bridges can be. It's very hard to completely destroy a bridge. Bridges can be damaged, but I mean, the Kerch Bridge is 12 miles long. And so you can put a few holes in it and they can be repaired. And by and large, the Russians will put a very high priority on keeping the bridge operational. But just like the airport around Moscow, you can take it out of commission for long periods. You can inconvenience everybody. You can make it vulnerable by attacks. But one single attack probably wouldn't do it. You'd need to repeated attacks and you'd end up using a lot of hardware to actually create a number of holes in the bridge that it took some time to repair. And actually bringing down a real span of the bridge, which is what the Ukrainians have tried to do, I mean, is very difficult. They've had 3 successes. The first one was probably ultimately the most successful. The second and third ones have been successful in a military sense, but not really successful in making the bridge impossible for the Russians to use for long periods.
Dom, there's one here for you. Trump claims he could cripple the Russian economy with punitive sanctions. So why doesn't he?
Well, good question. I think we'd have to ask him, really. But I think, there's a whole lot of debate about what is going on in Trump's mind and why he seems to be afraid of Vladimir Putin. As Fiona Hill, who's obviously the British-born American analyst who worked for Trump, but is an expert on both Putin and Trump, if you like. And she clearly thinks that the American president is afraid of the Russian leader and seems to be under some kind of spell. He has threatened these sanctions, which would be crippling because Russia is still able to sell its oil. So it's the same kind of game the Americans are playing with the Iranians, which is that you punish you sanction those companies and tanker companies, but also countries who are selling on Russian oil as they are doing with Iranian oil. It's been very effective against the Iranians, and that would be devastating for the Russian economy. But I think probably if you ask the White House, they would say that's something that's a kind of a last resort. That's something that the administration is keeping in reserve. He has threatened that. But what we see with Trump is a kind of pattern of generally letting Putin get away with it, generally giving the Russians the benefit of the doubt, and then every now and then coming out with sort of strong words, which are fairly isolated. So he'll say, he said most recently that Putin's gone crazy when Putin had launched a devastating wave of attacks. But when it comes to kind of confronting the Russian leader, as we saw most recently in that phone call, he doesn't really follow through on these, as I say, fairly sporadic outbursts of protest against what the Russians are doing. In that phone call with Vladimir Putin, he didn't, for instance, say to him, didn't warn him against carrying out the kind of retaliation that Putin said he would carry out. And we've a couple of times now kind of heard Trump almost acting or sounding like a Kremlin mouthpiece. Instead of saying, he's told me he's going to take revenge for this attack and I've warned him not to, and there will be punishment if he does so, he simply says the Russian leader's going to do this, kind of implying that he feels he has a right to do so. And I think he said yesterday to Friedrich Merz, the German Chancellor, that he's going to take retaliatory action and it's not going to be pretty. So, there's a whole debate about what Trump's kind of attitude to Putin is. But certainly so far, he hasn't really followed through on that threat to apply these secondary sanctions that would be crippling to the Russian economy.
Yeah, and Dom, you more or less answered one of the other questions here about the kind of Russian propaganda and aggression efforts and whether Trump is becoming Putin's megaphone in all of this. We have a couple of minutes left, but I just wanted to ask both of you. Perhaps, Michael, first, if you could go in terms of what you think is likely to happen now and next.
Okay, I mean, I think the United States is walking away from peace talks. I think Trump is walking away. The next two questions are: who does he blame? Does he blame Zelensky or Putin, or who does he blame more? And Putin is trying to maneuver him into blaming Zelensky for sure. So that's the first next question: who does he blame? And then the next question after that is: do the Americans keep on providing some intelligence help to the Ukrainians? If they do, then the Ukrainians could carry on, if they choose to, with the Europeans helping them with hardware and the Americans helping them with intelligence software. So that's where I think we're going. The Americans walk away. Who does Trump blame? Will the Americans carry on with intelligence help? If the answer is, he blames Zelensky and they won't carry on with intelligence help, then the whole balance of forces in Ukraine during this year will change, and the Russians for sure will get the Donbass and maybe all of Zaporizhia and maybe get back into all of Kherson, even if the Ukrainians keep fighting with the Americans not actually backing up Ukraine with intelligence.
And Dom?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think Michael's right. I think, the big question is Trump about to walk away? All the signs are that he is going to. I think if you talk to Western diplomats, that's what they're really worried about. That's why they put so much effort into the ceasefire process. They're pretty, I think, realistic about the chances of progress in that, but they do believe it's the best way for now to stop Trump from throwing his hands up in the air and despairing and saying, as he said yesterday, that these are just two children playing. Sometimes you have to let them get on with it, which obviously if Ukrainian is outrageous, it gives a kind of moral equivalence to the aggressor and the invaded that they find completely outrageous from someone who's meant to be an ally and a friend. But that's certainly how Trump sees it. So there is a grave danger that he walks away. And I think we have to be pretty, realistic about the chances of the ceasefire, the diplomatic process going anywhere, because the bottom line is Putin believes that at some point the West is going to back down. So if he believes that, there's no point in suing for peace. He's not going to want to end this war, which he ultimately currently believes he's winning. On the battlefield, there's a strong argument to make that he is winning in a very sort of incremental war of attrition kind of way. But if the West does back down, he believes he can really do a lot better there. And obviously Trump's equivocation, the way Trump is constantly giving the Russian leader kind of the benefit of the doubt, is giving him even greater hope that the West will at some point back down. So he's not going to go for peace. And I think he sees an opportunity, certainly if Trump walks away, because if Trump does take with him not just military aid, but military intelligence, as Michael was saying there, the Ukrainians are in deep trouble. And then, of course, as we keep saying, what does Europe do next? Does Europe fill that vacuum? Very hard for them to do so in terms of intelligence, but they certainly could bring a lot more to bear in terms of economic aid and military aid. But yeah, very big questions ahead for both Kyiv and also for those Western capitals supporting it.
Indeed, very much so. And we're going to continue our coverage and analysis. And Dom, Michael, thank you both for answering all of those questions and for all of your analysis.